Welcome to Records Retention 101 for local governments. My name is Julie Wagner. I'm a Government Information Analyst here at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. So you might be wondering who we are and what are we doing. For those of you who are not familiar with TSLAC, there are 6 analysts at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, or TSLAC as I'll be calling us throughout the rest of the presentation. Our job is to advise state and local governments on rules and best practices for records management. So we answer questions on records retention, destruction, electronic records, filing systems, disaster planning, preservation, just about anything you can think of. TSLAC is also a rule-making agency, so we spend a lot of time researching and updating those rules as well. You can think of us as kind of your go-to experts for records-related questions. We get pretty consistent feedback from various local governments asking for exactly what this webinar is. A bare bones, just the facts introduction to records retention. Today we'll introduce you to some of the most important skills and terms a records manager needs to know, including how to read schedules, where to find rules and regulations, and what qualifies as a record. Our goals for today, we want to make sure you leave with a clear understanding of what is and is not a record and how to find its retention. We're going to explain why we have these rules and how we've developed them. We'll show you where to go and what resources to utilize to find out how long to keep your records. And we'll tell you where to go and who to talk to when you don't know what to do. We're also going to have some records management examples at the end of the webinar so you can see what it's like when you call us, and we're going to have a live Q&A at the end to answer all of your retention questions. So you might be wondering, why do we even have retention rules? Proper records retention is vital in order to provide access to government records. Retention rules tell you how long you have to provide that access by law. Retention can vary by record type, so retention rules are in place to help governments navigate the choppy waters of proper records management. In Texas, there are broad open records laws under the Public Information Act that give the public the right to almost everything you've written or recorded as a government employee. We also have the Open Meetings Act to make sure that our governing bodies are conducting business in a transparent way. Finally, in Texas, we have some specific records management laws that support the other laws by ensuring that governmental agencies are required to keep records for a reasonable amount of time. In addition to applicable Texas laws like these, there are also numerous federal mandates as well, which are considered in the retention rules set by TSLAC. The rules are there to help you know not only how long you have to keep a certain record, but also to give you reasons why. So where do we get our rulemaking authority? When the state legislature passed the Local Government Records Act in 1989, it gave 3 reasons for doing so. 1, to make local governments run more efficiently, and in doing so, to keep costs down. 2, to make sure that records of permanent historical value were being preserved and protected. And 3, to establish standards and procedures for protecting public information. This rule is where TSLAC derives its authority to make rules and establish standards. If you would like to read up on the specifics of the Local Government Records Act, we publish it as Bulletin D on our website. It's a really useful resource to have when you're being asked, why do we have to do this? It provides helpful legal requirements and definitions. There's a link there at the bottom of the slide. So you might be thinking, records, what are they and what do I do with them? First, what is considered a record? A local government record is any recorded information that documents the transaction of public business. It is created or received by a local government. Anything meeting these criteria is considered a record even if it contains confidential information. So the fact that it might be exempt from a public information request does not take away from its status as a record. It's still a record even if it contains confidential information. And a record exists in any medium: paper, electronic, sound recordings, videos. This also means that most emails are records. Telephone messages can be records, DVDs contain records, any format. Since almost everything you touch is a record, it's a little easier to define a record by what is not a record. This would include convenience copies, which are extra identical copies of documents created only for convenience of reference or research. Only one copy should be the record copy, and you should determine who in your local government will be responsible for keeping it through the full retention period. Copies of documents that you produce for a Public Information Request Act are not records. The records of the request are records, like the email from the requester, but the copies of the actual information requested are not. Blank forms or stocks of publications are not records. One single publication should be kept as the record copy, but all of the extras are not records. Library and museum materials are not records. And finally, the Local Government Records Act is very specific about alternative dispute resolution working files not being records. There are certain intrinsic values that records have, and those values help us determine what to keep and how long to keep it. So let's look at some records that you might personally have in your own home and look at what value they might hold. Our first value is financial or fiscal. These records would be things like your W-2s, tax documents, bank statements, or investment statements. The second kind of record you'll have are the ones with historical value. These would be things like personal photos, baby books, family trees, and other mementos that have value to your own history. Then you'll have records with administrative value, records that have some kind of everyday business use to you, like your car's owner manual or personal medical records. You probably also have records with legal value. These would be things like will, power of attorney, deeds and property titles, or your lease. So we're going to revisit these record values in the context of local government records in your entity in just a little bit. But for now, you should have a general understanding of these four record values. There are two other kinds of value that every record has. If you really think about it, records are created for a reason, and then they are used for something. What a record is used for when it's created is the record's primary value. But then many records can have a secondary value beyond the purpose for which they were originally created. I'm going to illustrate primary versus secondary with a couple of examples. Let's look at a Texas driver's license. Its primary value is to prove that a person can drive, but it has secondary value as an identity document, something you can use to vote, apply for a loan, and have any kind of fun. Another example is the U.S. Census. The 2010 census is useful right now if you're looking for a snapshot of the current U.S. population. That is the administrative value of the census, current demographic information. Does that mean that the U.S. government should destroy all of its census records as soon as the next census comes out? No, of course not, because over time, the census becomes historically valuable. The 1940 census was recently released, digitized, and offered online. People are using the 1940 census to do all kinds of historical and genealogical research now, because if you're looking for a snapshot of the U.S. population in 1940, or you're trying to track down a person who might have lived in 1940, this is the record that you need. So that is the secondary value of this record, as a snapshot of U.S. history.
Okay, Julie, so we got one question in so far, and I thought now would be a good time.
Sure.
So what is an alternative dispute resolution working file? Well, I can actually take this if you don't.
Sure.
It's actually a way to settle a court case without charges being filed. A third-party mediator works with the two parties to come to an agreement, and the agreement is kept, but the working files are not considered records. Thanks for your question.
It's a tricky one. It's specifically laid out in that bulletin, though. All right, so you might have the question, maybe we should just keep everything in our office permanently. If records have this secondary value that I'm not even aware of, then why would we ever get rid of anything? Let's just keep everything to be on the safe side. Well, because there are negative consequences of keeping things too long, we're going to go over a couple of them here. First, you have storage cost. Buying filing cabinets, finding space for them, paying to store records in the records center, paying for server storage, etc. It adds up really quickly. As volume increases, retrieval becomes a much bigger challenge. It becomes harder and harder to wade through the old records just to find what you need. Employees' time is wasted and frustration increases. Also, you have to take measures to protect all of these records from things like temperature and humidity, disasters, accidental deletion, vermin, pests, hacker attacks, theft. There's all sorts of things you have to protect your records from. And finally, there's legal risk in having records longer than you need them. If your local government is sued and a record is requested as part of the prosecution's discovery request, then that record has to be produced whether or not you could have destroyed it years earlier. That means that keeping the record too long has created a vulnerability to your local government that didn't have to exist. Beyond the consequences of destroying something that still has value, there are legal consequences of not keeping records long enough. Intentional destruction of a record prior to the expiration of its retention period can be charged as a Class A misdemeanor, which is punishable by a fine not to exceed $4,000 and/or up to 1 year in jail. It can also be considered tampering with a governmental record, which is a third-degree felony, which is punishable by 2 to 10 years in jail and a fine of up to $10,000. And one could also be subject to criminal penalties under the Public Information Act. You might be wondering, maybe you have multiple copies of something and want to know if you have to keep all of them at the same time in the same way. Well, remember, we've said that convenience copies are not records. You only need to retain one copy of any given record. So which copy will that be? What copy? We don't really care who keeps it and how long, as long as one copy is kept, excuse me. But in order to control the proliferation of information, especially in a digital environment where there can easily be 17 copies of something scattered across a shared drive, we recommend that you decide whose copy will be the record copy and then decide what format the record copy will be in. It could be paper, electronic, even on a VHS tape. Just decide which one is the official record copy. So say you have a department where 2 or 3 people are keeping a record on paper. Another keeps it on a flash drive. One has it on a CD. A couple others keep copies on their desktops. One has the copy on their laptop, and a few access the record on the shared drive on the server. All of those copies don't need to be maintained for the full retention period. So maybe they decide that the copy is on the shared drive on the server will be the record copy. Since the server is backed up nightly and there's less chance of them losing any data, this would be a great choice for the record copy. You should designate record copies regularly and make sure your staff are aware of the choice to avoid accidental deletion or extra convenience copies. When it comes to all of the records retention terminology, it can be very overwhelming when you're just starting out. So we're going to walk through a few of the most common terms so you can use them with confidence going forward. You might have seen this scary term floating around already, records retention schedule. Let's break it down a bit. We've discussed what a record is already. Essentially, it's recorded information that documents government business. Retention, simply put, is the continued possession, use, or control of something. You've probably heard the phrase employee retention or water retention. It's the same idea: hold, keep, save. And finally, schedule. That's a plan for carrying out a process. That's all your schedule is, a plan to keep things. So a records retention schedule is a document that's central to records management program because it lists all of your government's records and tells you how long you have to keep them. You'll be using it a lot. Another definition that you'll need going forward is record series. Let's look at an example that you probably have in your own personal records, your 2014 tax return. That tax return contains a few different items. The 1040 form, if you have used one, your W-2, maybe a 1099 if you have interest income. Maybe you claim deductions for medical bills, charitable donations, child care, and so you keep receipts that support those deductions at home. And maybe there are some other assorted things you keep in that file, like the confirmation email you got from your tax software or a tracking number. Well, all of those records would be grouped together into a record series that we would call your 2014 tax return. A records retention schedule does the same thing. It groups certain types of records together to make them more manageable. Now here's an example of a record series in a local government, an employment application. When you submit that application form to apply for a job, you might have also sent in your resume, a cover letter, letters of reference, maybe a writing sample. The local government keeps all of those items under one single record series. That's just called employment applications. The retention period is just the length of time that your local government is required to keep the record. So from the previous slide, we know that those individual items are grouped together into one record series, and the entire records retention period is 2 years from the creation or receipt of the record or the personnel action involved, whichever is later. We keep referring to schedules, and you might not yet be familiar with them. There are the 12 local schedules that TSLAC publishes. Each contains specialized records that are specific to different government offices. For example, records for county clerks would be contained in Local Schedule CC. Records of taxing authorities would be in Local Schedule TX. Any public safety records are found in Local Schedule PS. And Local Schedule GR has all of the records that are common to all local government offices. So things like minutes, personnel records, correspondence, payroll, and accounts receivable and payable. Now, together, these schedules contain over 1,500 record series. Not everything that is listed on the schedule is going to apply to your office, and that's fine. Just use the series for the records that you create. Think of these as your one-size-fits-all schedules that you can adopt now and then tailor to your individual government needs later by amending them. We're not going to go very deep into this, but I do want you to be aware that some governments choose to create a customized retention schedule based upon the schedules we publish. This is called a records control schedule. Some local governments like to create specialized records control schedules so they can divide up series by department or add in special instructions unique to their own government. Other local governments just fill out a form selecting which of our local schedules they will be using and submit that form to us. That form is called a Declaration of Compliance. We often recommend that offices use the Declaration of Compliance because it's fast and easy and our schedules have been thoroughly researched already. In either case, if an entity wants to maintain a record longer than what is prescribed in TSLAC schedules, that's fine. We're most concerned with whether or not you're meeting the minimums. How do we come up with all these rules? Well, not exactly. If you're thinking that we come up with these retention periods at random, rest assured that there is a process. Let's take a quick look at how the local schedules are developed. As I said, the legislature has granted rulemaking authority to TSLAC. We are authorized by statute to establish retention rules for local governments. The retention rules are an administrative rule of our commission. Our division, the State and Local Records Management, has to research existing federal and state statutes that govern certain kinds of records. There are several federal rules, for example, governing employee records like job evaluations. So first we look to see if there's already a rule out there that we can incorporate into the schedule. If there isn't, then we try to evaluate the administrative, fiscal, legal, and potential historical value of these common government records. Also, we look to professional organizations for information on best practices. For example, many of the retention periods set in Local Schedule JC, which are records for public junior colleges, are influenced by retention periods recommended by the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. Once our commission has approved a final draft of the schedule, then the local schedules go through the rulemaking process. The changes are posted in the Texas Register for public comment. Anyone can comment on these retention rules. Agencies, local governments, private companies, citizens, the media, anyone. We have to review all public comments and then take them back to the commission to determine what changes need to be made, if any. So great, schedules. Now how in the world do you read them? Let's say you go to our website and pull up one of the local schedules. Schedule GR in PDF. Here's what it looks like. It's a table that you can read. Before each section, there may be some notes about the scope of the section, special retention notes about a certain series, or other helpful information. Let's take a closer look at one of the series. This is an example from Local Schedule GR, which is for records common to all local governments. In the first column, we might have the record number. This is a unique number assigned to this series by us. It very well might have no significance to you. It's just how we uniquely identify each series. It might be helpful to have this number if you call us with a question, since titles of things can vary pretty widely. So maybe you call a form by a particular name, but we know it as something different. In this example, the record number is GR1003F. Next is the record title. That's what TSLAC calls this series. It's meant to be a very general identifier for the records. For this example, the title is just minutes. Then we have the record description. This will be the scope of the series. It goes into detail about the kinds of records that would typically be classified here. So you can see in the description that this series would include certified audio tapes of closed meetings. Next we have the retention period, which you know is the minimum amount of time that you have to keep these records. Sometimes this is just a number of months or year, 22 months, 4 years. But sometimes there are qualifiers or codes, which we'll look at in a moment. In this one, the retention period is simply 2 years. Finally, we have the remarks column. This is where we would add extra information that may help you understand the series a little bit better. If there are any statutes, laws, or regulations that govern the retention of a series, those will be listed here. We also add information about evaluating records for historical significance here, as well as any special instructions like having a judge sign off for the disposition. We also list other series that may be involved with this series or exceptions to the retention rules. As I said, you will see and become familiar with a few shorthand codes for retention periods. One of the most common you'll see is AV, which means as long as administratively valuable. This code means that you get to decide whenever the record ceases to have any kind of business value to your government, you can dispose of it. So maybe you receive an email that says a certain meeting has been moved from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. That email would fall into a series called transitory information, which has a period of AV. Really, as soon as you've read that email, it has served its purpose and no longer has any business value to you, so you can delete it. However, maybe your local government is in possession of some historical photographs. Those fall into a series: photographs, images, recordings, and other non-textual media. That also has a retention period of AV. Since those photos have historical significance, however, you'd probably want to keep them as documentation of that town's history. FE means fiscal year end. This is a pretty self-explanatory code. It's the last day of the fiscal year. So if your fiscal year is like ours, the fiscal year end is August 31st. But maybe your government has the same fiscal year as the federal government, in which case fiscal year end would be September 30th. Many financial records, like invoices, have a retention period of FE plus 3 years. So if an invoice was received in July 2013, it can be disposed of on August 31st, 2016. And finally, US means until superseded. This is until the record has been replaced by an updated version. For example, policy and procedures manuals have a retention period of US plus 5. So you would be able to destroy an old manual 5 years after it's been replaced by a new manual. Let's take a look at the services that the analysts at TSLAC can offer you now. What do you do when you run up against a records problem and you don't know how to handle it? Well, you can always look on our website or call one of our analysts at TSLAC for an answer. But your best resource will be your local government's RMO. What's an RMO, you're asking? Well, an RMO, or Records Management Officer, is the person in your government who is responsible for administering the records management program. He or she performs duties to keep you in compliance with the law. Maybe you've seen them around the office taking inventories of records, or they're the person you go to get approval to destroy records. Essentially, they're your go-to person for anything records management related. There are some common positions that get designated to be the Records Management Officer for local governments. For municipalities, it's often the city secretary. For independent school districts, we see a lot of business managers being designated as RMO. If your local government is rather large, the RMO might also have some records liaisons in different departments to help out with the records management program. These are people who assist with things like records destruction, inventories, and filing plans. How can you help your local government out with records management? Well, you know your records better than others, so you are the subject matter expert for those records. Have a conversation with your RMO. They count on you to know about new programs, which often lead to new records, training needs, and other general records management problems. We're going to go over a couple of examples of what happens when you call one of the analysts at TSLAC. Hopefully this will provide you a bit of an idea of the kinds of questions we ask and the resources we can provide for you. Here are some things that we might ask of you when you call us. These are the types of questions that help us understand what kind of record we're dealing with and why. Believe it or not, we do not have every local government record memorized, so we're going to need your help. Here are things we might ask. What is the record being used for? Understanding the function of that record often helps us classify it. Often it's a matter of vocabulary. Your purchase order is our purchase voucher, or accounts payable information is also going to be a purchase voucher. Your financial report might be our fee book. You see how that works. Who handles the record? This helps us identify its function. Is it a human resources record, an accounting record? We might ask, who submits this record to you and who signs it? Does this get submitted to a federal or state agency? This question helps us determine what rules might govern the record. If you tell us that you submit the record to the U.S. Department of Education, then we are able to call the U.S. Department of Education to ask them if they have any pertinent retention rules for that particular record. And finally, can you send me a sample? This is extremely helpful to us. If it's at all possible to attach a sample of the record you're asking about, it really helps us understand the record better and helps us to identify the series more quickly. One of the most common questions we receive here at TSLAC is, how long do I keep blank? So let's say that someone calls and asks, how long do I keep insurance policies? Well, I know that that record is contained in Local Schedule GR. So I do a search and I pull up series GR 1029 insurance policies. The description says liability, theft, fire, health, life, automobile, and other policies for local government property and personnel, including supporting documentation relevant to the implementation, modification, renewal, or replacement of policies. And the retention period is 4 years after the expiration or termination of the policy according to its terms. A fairly straightforward search and find. Many of the questions we receive are just about how long to keep a certain record, but sometimes it isn't as clear-cut as just figuring out how long to keep a certain record, a single record, excuse me. For example, say someone calls and asks, how long do I keep employee personnel files? Well, we don't have a single series for employee personnel records because there are a lot of different records that could be put in a personnel file. So let's say there's an employee file for Jane Smith. There might be a certificate or license in her file, and it's required for her to qualify for or remain eligible to hold her position. Well, there's a specific series for that, GR 1050-04, and the retention is until superseded or the date of separation of that employee plus 5 years. Maybe there's also her application for employment in the folder. That would be kept under GR 1050-14 for a period of 2 years from the creation or receipt of the record, or the last personnel action involved, whichever is later. Most employees receive job evaluations periodically as well, so Jane has those in her folder as well. They would be maintained under GR 1050-21, performance appraisals, until it's superseded plus 2 years, or the date of separation of the employee plus 2 years. And finally, Jane's employee service record, which is a summary of her employment history with this employer, positions held, wages, and salary rates are kept in the file. That record would be maintained under GR 1050-12 for a period of 75 years from the date of separation of Jane from the employer. Another kind of question we often get asked is a more vague question like, How long do I keep an ETR 35? Well, off the top of my head, I have no idea what an ETR 35 is, so I'll have to ask some follow-up questions. First, I'll want to know who I'm talking to and what government you're from. Turns out in this case, I would have been talking to someone in a police department for a municipality. Next, I would need to know more about the ETR 35. Is it a report, some kind of form? It turned out that the ETR 35 is a form that's used to submit training hours to the Department of Public Safety and the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. So I look into TSLAC's schedule and I see that there's a series for training and educational achievement records that also include records that document the training of an employee if the training is required. This series would be GR 1050-28A, and it would need to be kept for 5 years after the employee separates from the local government. A question that we've been getting a lot lately is, I can't find red light camera records in the schedule. What should I do? For those of you who are unfamiliar, red light camera enforcement records are the records produced from the cameras at intersections that capture videos and images of cars that go through the intersection once the light has turned red. And it's true that if you search our schedule, you won't find a series specifically for red light camera records. We've added red light camera enforcement records to the list of revisions we'll consider when developing the next edition of Local Schedule PS. But revising schedules is a lengthy process, and people don't want to keep those records indefinitely. However, we do have a series that would fit the records for now being created by these programs. They're just not in one series, much like the employee personnel file. So for the videos that do not capture a violation, we recommend keeping them under PS 4050-06 surveillance videos, which is described as video surveillance for, but not limited to, security of property and persons, and it's kept for a period of AV or as long as administratively valuable. For any photos and or videos that do capture a violation, we recommend keeping them under PS 4125-05B1, which are offense investigation records for Class C misdemeanors and unclassified violations of state law or local ordinance punishable by fine only. This series includes any evidence and citations issued and has a retention period of 6 months. And law enforcement requires some information from the Department of Motor Vehicles to match the image of the license plate with the owner of the vehicle. This information would be kept under PS 4175-05C, which are records of dissemination, receipt, and inquiry for law enforcement information. This series carries a retention period of AV. You might have heard of a similar type of record, which is the body cam footage. We recently published a blog post on our blog, The Texas Record, all about retention for body cam footage, which you can check out at our blog, which we have a link to later in the webinar. Another really common question that we get is, how long do I keep emails? Well, of course, an email isn't really the record. It's just the format that the record is in. What really determines which record series the record will be retained under is the content of the email. In this case, the email is a cover letter, which we previously said is maintained under GR 1050-14 employment applications. Some questions, of course, require us to dig a little deeper. For example, we were once asked a question regarding the retention of standardized tests. The question concerned how long to retain standardized test results when someone in grades K through 8 takes a high school level test. If we look at the retention note for the series for standardized testing results, it seems to indicate that the retention is based on the grade that the student is in when he or she takes the test. But if an 8th grader takes a STAR algebra test, which is typically given to 9th graders, would the results need to be maintained permanently in the academic achievement record? To find out, we contacted the Texas Education Agency directly to see if they had any additional information that may pertain to the question. As it turns out, the person we contacted provided us with a great deal more information from what the Texas Administrative Code says about the inclusion of test results in each student's academic record. It had to do with the required state assessment minimum standards that are included in the Texas Education Code. This includes this. Entries regarding state assessment graduation requirements must be supported in the student's permanent records by test labels or an electronic data file from the testing contractor. Since the STAR algebra test is a graduation requirement, it would need to be maintained in the permanent academic achievement record. No, we actually have a lot more resources to share with you that you can check out after the webinar. A great way to keep up with any updates, news, training announcements, tips, etc. is by subscribing to our blog, which I mentioned earlier, The Texas Record. We typically have articles posted about once a week, and you receive an alert in your inbox when one is posted. And they cover all sorts of topics. I know that this already seems like a lot of information, and getting your records organized may seem like a huge challenge right now, especially if you've never done it before. A great place to start is by taking an inventory of the records that you are personally responsible for. This will help you identify what is past its retention and help you identify the series that you create and or receive. There's some helpful guidance for inventorying available in Bulletin C, which is also available on our website. In addition to this webinar, we also have a variety of training, both face-to-face and online. We have a great series of archived webinars. All of them are around about an hour in length, and all of them are free. So if you're all fired up and you want to talk to one of the analysts here at TSLAC, you can find out which one of us is assigned to your region at the link on the slide. You can also call our main line or email us, and you'll just be routed to the correct analyst. And with that, I want to thank you for attending. All right, does anyone have any questions before we get out of here?
Okay, it looks like no one has any questions today. So again, thanks for joining us. Great job, Julie. A lot of really good information. And we'll see you guys next time.